The great chamber of the Galactic Arbitration Council floated in the darkness between stars. A massive structure of crystal and light that had stood for 10,000 years as the seat of justice for all known civilization's arbiter Kethvallen moved through the empty hall, his crystalline body catching the light of distant suns that filtered through the transparent walls. And he felt nothing but cold satisfaction as he prepared to deliver the final verdict. In case 7291 Sol, the case had been simple, almost boring in its familiarity, because young species always made the same mistakes when they first reached for the stars. Humanity, a primitive civilization from a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow sun, had committed what the Council considered an unforgivable crime. And they had done so without even knowing that laws existed beyond their tiny corner of the galaxy. For decades, the humans had been broadcasting signals into space, radio waves and television transmissions, and desperate mathematical sequences aimed at the stars. All of them unencrypted and loud and impossible to ignore. These signals had violated 17 separate articles of the Covenant of Silence, the ancient agreement that governed how civilizations were supposed to behave in the protected regions of space where elder species still slumbered. In their ancient tombs, the punishment for such violations was severe but fair. At least by Council standards, extinction-level quarantine, the Council would collapse the outer planets of the Sol system, crushing Jupiter and Saturn and Neptune into gravitational anchors that would create an inescapable cage around the inner worlds. And humanity would be trapped forever, unable to leave, unable to grow, unable to threaten the peace of the galaxy. Kethvallen had seen this sentence carried out hundreds of times before, and he had never felt a moment of doubt about its justice. The other Council members had already departed, their votes cast and recorded, and none of them had bothered to stay for the formal announcement, because none of them cared about one more primitive species being locked away for eternity. Case 7291 Sol, Kethvallen announced to the empty chamber, his voice echoing off the crystal walls, is hereby closed, and the sentence of quarantine shall commence in 40 standard rotations. He paused, waiting for some response that would never come, because the humans had sent no representatives to their own trial. They had not even known the trial was happening. The Council had debated whether to inform them, but the consensus had been clear. What was the point of warning a species that could not possibly defend itself, or change the outcome in any meaningful way? It would only cause unnecessary panic and suffering. And the Council prided itself on being merciful even in its harshness. 40 rotations was more time than most species received, a generous window that would allow the humans to make peace with their fate. Before the cage closed around them forever, Kethvallen turned away from the empty witness stands and began the long walk back to his private chambers, already thinking about the next case on his schedule, a border dispute between two trading empires that had been arguing for centuries. He did not give humanity another thought, but far across the galaxy, deep beneath the red surface of Mars, Admiral Chen Wei-Lin was thinking about the Council very carefully indeed. The facility she commanded did not exist in any official record, and the 200 scientists and soldiers who worked there had all been declared dead in various accidents over the past decade, because the work they did could never be acknowledged by any government on Earth. Chun stood in the center of the listening room, surrounded by screens that displayed data streams from a network of quantum relays that her team had spent 15 years building in secret. And she watched as the arbiter delivered his verdict to an empty chamber. "They think we did not send representatives because we did not know," she said quietly, and her voice was steady despite the weight of what she had just witnessed. Her second in command, a young officer named Marcus Webb, stood beside her with his hands clasped behind his back and his face carefully blank. "They sentenced us to eternal imprisonment," he said, And they did not even bother to tell us we were on trial. They thought it would be kinder, Chun replied. And there was something sharp and cold in her voice that made everyone in the room stand a little straighter. 40 days. Webb said. That is not enough time to do anything, Admiral. And we both know it. Chun turned to look at him. And her expression changed into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth at all. 40 days is more time than they should have given us, she said. And it is more time than they will wish they had given us when this is over. She walked to the main console and pressed her hand against the identification panel, unlocking files that only 3 people in all of human history had ever been authorized to access. Send the signal to Earth, she ordered. All channels, all governments, all military commanders. And tell them that the situation we have been preparing for has finally arrived. Webb hesitated for just a moment before he moved to obey, because he knew that the signal Chun was about to send would change everything that humanity had ever believed about its place in the universe. What do we tell them? He asked. When they ask what we are supposed to do. Chun looked up at the screens one more time, watching the Arbiter walk away from the chamber where he had just condemned 8 billion people to a fate worse than death. And she felt something ancient and fierce rising up in her chest. We tell them the truth, she said. That we are not alone, that we have enemies we never knew existed, and that we have 40 days to prove that humanity is not as helpless as the galaxy believes. She paused and let her words sink into the silence of the room. And we tell them that we have been getting ready for this moment for a very long time. Across the solar system, in bunkers and laboratories and military bases that the public had never heard of, encrypted messages began to arrive. And men and women who had spent their careers preparing for a threat they hoped would never come finally learned that their time had arrived, the Council believed. The case was closed. They believed humanity would panic and fragment and destroy itself before the quarantine even began, because that was what every other species had done when faced with the same impossible situation. They had studied humans from a distance and concluded that they were predictable creatures, emotional and tribal and incapable of uniting against a common enemy. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The news broke across Earth like a wave crashing against a shore. And for exactly 6 hours the world held its breath in collective terror as governments confirmed what most people refused to believe: aliens were real. And they had sentenced humanity to eternal imprisonment without even bothering to inform anyone that a trial had taken place. The Galactic Council had given them 40 days before the quarantine would seal the solar system forever. And according to every expert who appeared on television in those first terrible hours, there was absolutely nothing that humanity could do to prevent it. The expected chaos lasted less than a day. In Washington and Beijing and Moscow and 100 other capitals around the world, leaders who had spent decades opposing each other sat down at the same tables and made decisions that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. The Emergency Unification Compact was signed within 72 hours of the initial announcement, a document that dissolved old alliances and created new ones, that ended ancient rivalries and demanded cooperation from every nation on Earth. Corporations that had spent fortunes protecting their secrets suddenly opened their vaults and shared everything they had, because patents and profits meant nothing if humanity was going to be trapped in a cage for the rest of eternity. Scientists who had competed against each other for funding and recognition found themselves working side by side in facilities that seemed to appear overnight. Massive structures of steel and glass, where the greatest minds in human history gathered to solve problems that had never been solved before. Admiral Chun Wei-Lin watched all of this happen from her command center on Mars, and she allowed herself a small moment of pride in her species before she returned her attention to the work that still needed to be done. "They are moving faster than we expected," Marcus Webb reported as he reviewed the incoming data streams. The European Fusion Project has been combined with the Chinese Quantum Computing Initiative, and the Americans have released their entire classified research archive to the global network. "Fear is a powerful motivator," Chun replied. "And there is nothing quite like the threat of extinction to make people forget why they were fighting in the first place." She walked to a different section of the command center, where a team of scientists was working on something that the rest of the world knew. Nothing about Dr. Yuki Tanaka stood at the center of the group. A small woman with gray hair and tired eyes who had spent 30 years being dismissed as a brilliant eccentric with ideas too strange to be taken seriously. Her theories about dimensional membrane physics had been called beautiful nonsense by her peers. Mathematical poetry that had no connection to the real universe. Now those theories were humanity's only hope. "Tell me where we stand," Chun said as she approached the group. Tanaka looked up from her calculations and pushed her glasses higher on her nose. Before she answered, "The Council's containment field operates in standard 4-dimensional space," she explained. 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, which is the framework that most species use because it is the easiest to understand and manipulate. "But space has more dimensions than that," Chun said, because she had been studying Tanaka's work for years and understood it better than most. "Exactly," Tanaka confirmed with a small nod. "And the Council either does not know about those extra dimensions, or they believe that no species would be foolish enough to try to use them." She pulled up a holographic display that showed a complex web of mathematical equations and geometric shapes that seemed to twist and fold in ways that hurt the eyes to look at. "We do not need to break their cage," Tanaka continued. "We need to step around it, to move sideways into a dimension that exists parallel to our own reality, but outside the boundaries of their containment field." "Can we do it?" Chun asked. "In 40 days." Tanaka was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with the weight of everything she was about to say. "We can build the door," she said carefully, "but I cannot promise that what waits on the other side will be survivable, because no one has ever gone where we are planning to go." Chun looked at the equations floating in the air between them, symbols and numbers that represented either salvation or oblivion for every human being who had ever lived. "Then we build the door," she said, "and we trust that humanity will find a way to survive whatever comes next." On the moon, construction began within hours of that conversation. The facility rose from the gray dust like nothing humanity had ever built before. A massive ring of metal and crystal that drew power from a dozen fusion reactors working at maximum capacity. Workers arrived from every nation on Earth. Engineers and technicians and laborers who had volunteered for a mission that most of them did not fully understand. And they worked in shifts around the clock because there was no time to rest. The structure they were building had no name, because no one could agree on what to call something that had never existed before. But the workers themselves had started calling it the door. It was an accurate description. The door was exactly what it sounded like. A passage from one state of being to another. From the universe that humanity had always known to something else entirely. No one knew what waited on the other side. The theories suggested that the space between dimensions was survivable. A void where matter and energy could exist in forms that standard physics could not predict or explain. But theories were not the same as certainty. There was a real possibility that stepping through the door would kill everyone who tried it. There was an equally real possibility that whatever existed on the other side would be worse than death. But staying behind meant eternal imprisonment. Generations upon generations of humanity, trapped in a cage they could never escape. And that was a fate that no one was willing to accept, We will need to evacuate as many people as possible, Chun said during a briefing with the Unified World Government. The door can only stay open for a limited time, and we will not be able to bring everyone. The leaders on the screens before her were silent, because they understood what she was really saying. Some people would be left behind. Some people would have to stay and face the quarantine, while others escaped through a door to an unknown destination. How many can we save? The Secretary General asked quietly. Chun took a deep breath before she answered, if everything goes according to plan, we can move approximately 2 billion people through the door before the quarantine field activates. And we are working on ways to increase that number. But I will not make promises I cannot keep. 2 billion people. It was an enormous number. More humans than had existed on Earth just a few centuries ago. But it was also less than a quarter of the current population. The rest would be trapped forever. We will begin the selection process immediately, the Secretary General said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. And we will pray that you are right about what waits on the other side. Chung nodded and ended the call. And then she stood alone in her command center and looked out at the stars that humanity might never see again. The council thought they had closed the case. They thought humanity would shatter under the weight of fear and despair, but they had never understood what humans were capable of when they had nothing left to lose. The door was almost ready, and humanity was about to knock on a wall that the universe had never expected anyone to knock on. The quarantine field activated exactly on schedule, and across the galaxy, the Galactic Council received confirmation that their sentence had been carried out. Massive gravitational forces crushed the outer planets of the Sol system into dense anchors of compressed matter, turning Jupiter into a bar of impossibly heavy material that bent space itself around. Its new form, Saturn's rings, collapsed inward and vanished in a flash of radiation that could be seen from light years away. Neptune simply ceased to exist in any form that physics could recognize. Its matter squeezed down to a point smaller than a grain of sand, but heavier than a mountain. The cage was complete. No ship could pass through the gravitational barriers that now surrounded the inner solar system, and no signal could escape the crushing forces that twisted space into an inescapable prison. Humanity was trapped forever, or so the Council believed. Arbiter Kethvelen received the report in his private chambers and felt a moment of something that might have been satisfaction, because another case had been closed and another threat to galactic peace had been contained. But alongside that satisfaction came something else, something unexpected and unwelcome that crawled through his crystalline mind like a crack spreading through ice unease. Play the final sensor readings from the Sol system, he commanded, and the holographic display before him flickered to life with data from the moments before the quarantine sealed the humans away. He had expected to see chaos every other species faced with extinction-level quarantine had responded the same way in their final hours, with panic and violence and desperate attempts to escape that accomplished nothing except to confirm that the Council had made the right decision. But the data from Sol showed something different. There were no distress signals, no weapons fire, no signs of the social collapse that always preceded the end. There was only silence, deep, complete, unnatural silence. Where are their transmissions? Kethvalen murmured to himself. Where is their fear? He reviewed the data again and again, searching for some explanation that would make sense. But the readings were clear. In the final days before the quarantine, humanity had simply stopped making noise. Their radio signals had ceased. Their television broadcasts had gone dark. Even the desperate mathematical sequences they had been sending toward the stars for decades had fallen silent. It was as if the entire species had decided to hold its breath at the same moment. They should be screaming, Catfallen said to the empty room. Every species screams, but humanity had not screamed. They had gone quiet in a way that no condemned species had ever gone quiet before. And Catfallen found himself unable to explain why that fact disturbed him so deeply. Months passed. The council moved on to other matters, other cases, other species that required judgment and correction. And gradually the strange silence of the Sol system faded from everyone's memory. Years turned into decades, and decades began to approach a century. Historians occasionally referenced humanity as an example of a promising species that had developed too quickly and paid the price for their recklessness. A cautionary tale that elders told to younger civilizations as a warning about the importance of following the rules. The quarantine zone around Sol became just another mark on the galactic maps, a region to be avoided and eventually forgotten inside the cage. Sensors detected no activity. No ships tried to escape through the gravitational barriers. No signals attempted to punch through the crushing forces that surrounded the inner planets. Just silence. Decade after decade, as if humanity had simply accepted its fate and faded away into quiet extinction. But the sensors were wrong. They were looking in the wrong direction, beyond the dimensional membrane, in a space that existed perpendicular to reality itself. Humanity was very much alive. The transit through the door had been brutal, beyond anything the scientists had predicted, and billions of people had died in the crossing as their bodies struggled to adapt to a form of existence that human biology had never been designed. For the survivors had emerged into a void that had no sun and no stars and no reference points of any kind. A darkness so complete that many people lost their minds simply from the absence of anything to look at, but others had adapted, slowly, painfully, over years that felt like centuries. Humanity had learned to survive in the space between spaces. Their bodies changed first, becoming something that was still human, but also something more. Flesh and bone reshaping itself to exist in dimensions that had never contained life before their minds changed next, expanding to perceive realities that would have driven their ancestors insane, and their technology changed most of all. As scientists who had once struggled to understand basic dimensional physics now manipulated the fabric of existence itself, like children playing with clay. Admiral Chen Wei-lin, now old beyond her years but still sharp and still fierce, stood at the center of what had become humanity's new home and looked out at the civilization her species had built in the impossible void. Cities floated in the darkness, structures of light and thought that defied every law of physics that humanity had once believed in. Ships moved between them, vessels that traveled through dimensions rather than across distances, appearing and disappearing in ways that would have seemed like magic to the humans who had been left behind in the cage. "We have found something," Dr. Tanaka said as she approached the Admiral, and her voice carried the weight of a discovery that would change everything. Chen turned to look at her oldest friend and saw something in Tanaka's eyes that she had not seen in years. "Hope. What did you find?" Chen asked. Tanaka gestured, and a holographic display appeared between them, showing structures that were clearly not of human origin. Vast ruins that drifted through the dimensional void like the bones of ancient giants. "We are not the first species to escape this way," Tanaka explained. "Others tried before us, dozens of civilizations that faced the same sentence and found the same door and stepped through into this space. Where are they now?" Chen asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Gone," Tanaka replied. "Most of them died within a few generations because they could not adapt to existence here. But they left behind their knowledge, their technology, their mistakes and their successes." She paused and let her next words sink in carefully. "They also left behind something else," she continued. "A map of sorts showing weak points in the dimensional barriers. Places where someone on this side could reach through and touch the universe they left behind. Chun felt her heart begin to beat faster as she understood what Tanaka was telling her. "We can go back," she said. "We can do more than go back." Tanaka replied with a smile that held no warmth and all the fierce determination of a species that had refused to die. "We can knock." And so humanity began to prepare, not for escape. Because they had already escaped, not for revenge. Because revenge was too small a word for what they were planning. They were preparing to remind the galaxy that the case had never really been closed at all. The first anomaly appeared on a listening post at the very edge of Council space. A small station staffed by 3 technicians whose only job was to monitor the background noise of the universe and report anything unusual. They had been doing this work for 12 years without finding anything interesting. That changed in a single moment. The signal came from inside a neutron star, a collapsed stellar remnant so dense that nothing could exist within it. Not matter, not energy, not any form of information that physics allowed. And yet the signal was there. Clear and strong and impossible to explain, the technicians checked their equipment 17 times before they reported what they had found. Because they knew that no one would believe them without absolute proof. They were right. The Council's response was immediate dismissal. A formal statement that the technicians had made an error, and that the anomaly was nothing more than equipment malfunction, combined with wishful thinking. But then a second signal appeared. This one came from within the event horizon of a black hole, the ultimate barrier beyond which nothing could escape. Not even light itself. The message was identical to the first. A simple mathematical sequence that repeated over and over again. And the scientists who studied it recognized it immediately. It was the same sequence that humanity had been broadcasting toward the stars before the quarantine. The mathematical greeting that they had sent out hoping to make contact with other intelligent life. Someone was sending it back. More signals followed in rapid succession, emerging from impossible locations throughout the galaxy, from the hearts of stars and the cores of dead planets and the spaces, between atoms where nothing was supposed to exist. Each one carried the same message. And each one proved that whoever was sending them had access to technology that the Council had never imagined possible. Arbiter Kethvalon convened an emergency session of the full Council, the first such gathering in 3,000 years. And the mood in the Great Chamber was unlike anything the ancient institution had ever experienced. Fear. "This is impossible," one of the elder counselors declared, their form flickering with agitation. "No species has ever escaped a quarantine field. And no technology exists that can transmit signals from inside a neutron star. And yet the signals exist," another counselor replied. "Unless you are suggesting that our entire sensor network has simultaneously malfunctioned in exactly the same way." The argument continued for hours. Theories and counter-theories flying back and forth across the chamber. Until finally a new signal arrived that silenced everyone. This one did not come from some impossible cosmic location. It appeared directly in the center of the Council chamber itself. A holographic projection that materialized out of thin air and resolved into the image of a human woman. She was older than any human the Council had ever observed. Her face lined with decades of hardship and triumph. And she moved with the easy confidence of someone who had nothing left to fear. "Greetings to the Galactic Arbitration Council," she said. And her voice filled the chamber like thunder rolling across an empty sky. "I am Admiral Chine Wei-Lin of the Human Expeditionary Command, and I am here to deliver a message on behalf of my species." Kethvalon felt his crystalline form crack in several places as he recognized the name from the old files. The human military leader who had been listed as deceased long before the quarantine was implemented. "You are supposed to be dead," he managed to say. "Your species is supposed to be contained." Chun smiled. and there was nothing warm or forgiving in her expression. "We received your verdict," she replied, 103 years ago by your calendar. "And after careful consideration, we have decided that we respectfully disagree with the sentence that was imposed upon us. Without our knowledge or consent." She paused to let her words sink in. "Therefore, under the laws of natural justice that exist beyond any treaty or covenant, we are formally requesting an appeal of Case 7291 Sol." The chamber erupted in chaos as counselors shouted over each other, some demanding that the transmission be shut down, others calling for military action, and still others simply staring in stunned silence at the impossible thing that was happening. Before them, Chun waited patiently until the noise died down. "We understand that this request may be unexpected," she continued, "and we have no desire to cause unnecessary conflict between our species and the galactic community. So we are prepared to offer you a choice." She raised one hand, and the holographic display expanded to show a complex timeline marked with dates and events. "You have 40 years, she said. "The same amount of time you gave us before you sealed our homeworld away forever. And in those 40 years you will reform the Covenant of Silence to ensure that no other species is ever condemned without a hearing. You will open your archives and reveal every case where a civilization was sentenced in absentia, and you will establish a process by which those sentences can be reviewed and potentially reversed. You will create a framework for genuine representation of all species in galactic governance, not just those who have been fortunate enough to avoid your judgment. And at the end of those 40 years, humanity will return to this chamber to participate in our appeal. Whether you have set us a place at the table or not." Cathvalen found his voice at last, though it cracked and wavered in ways it had never done before. "And if we refuse?" he asked. Chun's smile widened. "We have spent a century learning to exist in spaces that your science does not even believe in," she replied. "We can emerge anywhere in the galaxy without warning, and we can disappear just as quickly. And there is nothing your military can do to track us or contain us. But we are not here to threaten you, because threats are the tools of those who have no other options. And we have many options." She leaned forward slightly, and her image flickered between solid form and something else entirely, something that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. "We are here to offer you something you have never been offered before," she said. "The chance to be better than you have been, to build something more just than what exists, to prove that the Council can be more than a mechanism for punishment and control." 40 years, she repeated. "Use them wisely." The transmission ended as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the council chamber in silence so deep that even the ancient ventilation system seemed afraid to make noise. Cathvalen looked around at his fellow counselors and saw his own fear reflected in every face for 3,000 years. The council had been the final authority in galactic affairs, the arbiter of life and death for countless civilizations, and now a species they had tried to erase from existence had returned from the impossible and demanded accountability. The case was no longer closed, it had only just begun. 40 years passed like a held breath, and the galaxy was never quite the same during any of them. The council had fractured almost immediately after humanity's message, old alliances crumbling as different factions argued about how to respond to a threat they could not understand and could not fight. Some counselors had advocated for immediate military action, demanding that every possible emergence point be identified and destroyed before the humans could return. But the scientists had explained patiently that there were no emergence points to target. Humanity existed in a dimensional space that had no fixed connections to normal reality, and they could appear anywhere they chose without warning. Other counselors had pushed for negotiation, sending diplomatic messages into the void in hopes of making contact with the human leadership and arranging some kind of compromise. But humanity had gone silent again, watching and waiting and giving the council exactly the amount of time they had promised: 40 years, no more, no less. During those decades, the galaxy changed in ways that would have seemed impossible before humanity's return. The Covenant of Silence was rewritten 17 times as different factions fought over every word and every clause, until finally a version emerged that bore almost no resemblance to the original document. Quarantine without trial became illegal under the new laws, and every species facing judgment was guaranteed the right to representation and appeal. The archives were opened, reluctantly at first and then with increasing urgency as public pressure mounted from across the galaxy. The records revealed what many had long suspected: that the Council had condemned thousands of civilizations over the millennia, species that had been sealed away or destroyed without ever knowing why they were being punished. Some of those species had survived their sentences, trapped in quarantine zones that had been maintained for centuries without review. Others had not been so fortunate. The revelation sparked outrage that the Council had never experienced before. Protests and demands for justice that came from every corner of galactic civilization. Arbiter Kethvalan watched all of this happen from his chambers, his crystalline form now so webbed with cracks that he could barely move without pieces of himself falling away. He was ancient beyond measure, older than any other member of the Council, and he had presided over more sentences than he could remember. But he remembered humanity. He remembered the silence in the days before the quarantine, and he remembered the message that had appeared in the foliage, and he remembered the message that had appeared in the Murd. Council Chamber 143. Years after he had thought the case was closed forever, and he remembered the look in Admiral Chun Wei-Lin's eyes when she had promised to return on the 40th anniversary of humanity's ultimatum. Kethvalan took his place in the Great Chamber for what he knew would be the last time. The seats around him were filled with counselors new and old, representatives of species that had never been allowed a voice before, and observers from across the galaxy who had come to witness whatever was about to happen. The reformed Covenant hung on the walls in crystalline tablets, its new provisions visible for all to see, but everyone knew that the words on those tablets meant nothing if humanity did not accept them. The air in the chamber began to shimmer. A crack appeared in the space between two columns, a tear in the fabric of reality itself that widened slowly to reveal a passage to somewhere else, and through that passage stepped Admiral Chen Wei-Lin. She was older now, impossibly old, her hair white as starlight and her face marked by years that seemed to have passed differently than years were supposed to pass, but her eyes were the same, sharp and fierce and utterly unafraid. Behind her came others, humans who moved with a strange grace that suggested they were no longer entirely bound by the physics that governed normal matter. And behind them came something else, species that the Council had thought extinct, civilizations that had been condemned and forgotten, beings that had been trapped in quarantine zones for centuries before humanity had found them and set them free. Dozens of delegations filed through the dimensional door, taking seats in a chamber that suddenly seemed far too small for the crowd it now contained. The Veleth, a species of liquid consciousness that had been quarantined 6,000 years ago for the crime of existing in a form the Council found disturbing. The Karn, silicon-based entities that had been sentenced to extinction for refusing to abandon their homeworld when the Council decided that their sun was in the wrong location. The Mindari, the Crystalborn, the Void Singers, and 100 others whose names had been struck from galactic records so long ago that no one remembered they had ever existed. All of them stood with humanity. All of them had been rescued by humans who had refused to accept that some cases should stay closed forever. Admiral Chun walked to the center of the chamber and stood before Arbiter Kethvalon. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Chun raised her hand and activated a holographic display that showed the full text of the Reformed Covenant. "You made changes," she said, and her voice was neither angry nor forgiving. "Simply matter of fact, we did," Kethvalon replied. "The reforms were substantial, and they were genuine, and they represent the best efforts of the Council to address the injustices of the past." Chun studied the text for several seconds before she nodded slowly. "They are a good start," she said. "Not perfect, but better than what existed before. And we are prepared to accept them as the foundation for further negotiations." She turned to look at the delegations that had followed her through the door. All of those lost and forgotten species that humanity had gathered from the edges of oblivion. "But we have not come here only to discuss our own case," she continued. "We have come on behalf of everyone who was ever sentenced without a hearing, everyone who was sealed away without appeal, everyone whose story was supposed to end when the Council closed their file." She turned back to Kethvalon. "Case 7291 Saul is hereby reopened," she announced. "And we plead not guilty to all charges. Furthermore, we move that all related cases be reopened as well. Every quarantine and every sentence that was imposed under the old covenant, and that each of those cases be reviewed according to the new standards of justice that this council has adopted." She paused and let her words echo through the silent chamber. "The delegates behind me are prepared to testify," she said. "Each of them has a story to tell, and each of them deserves to be heard. And we will stay in this chamber for as long as it takes to ensure that every voice is acknowledged." Kethvalon looked at the crowd of species that filled the chamber, beings that the Council had tried to erase from existence, civilizations that had been written off as closed cases, and he understood, finally, what humanity had really been doing during their century in the void. Between dimensions, they had not been preparing for war. They had not been building weapons or gathering armies or planning revenge. They had been searching for everyone who had been left behind, every species that had suffered the same fate they had suffered. And they had been offering those species something that the Council had never thought to offer: a second chance. "The Council recognizes the delegation from Earth," Kethvalon said at last, and his voice cracked with emotion that he had not felt in millennia. "And the Council recognizes all delegations present, regardless of their status under previous judgments." He rose from his seat, pieces of his ancient crystalline form falling away as he moved, and he bowed his head to the human admiral who had refused to let her species die quietly. "How does the delegation from Earth plead?" he asked formally. Chun smiled, and for the first time since she had stepped through the door, there was warmth in her expression. "Not guilty," she said, "and ready to begin the work of building something better." Behind her, the delegations of 100 rescued species rose to their feet, and the chamber filled with sounds that had not been heard in galactic space for thousands of years. The voices of the forgotten, finally given a chance to speak. The case had never really been closed, and now, at last, humanity and all of its unexpected allies were ready to make sure it would be decided fairly. The galaxy would never be the same, but for the first time in 10,000 years, it had a chance to be better.